The bell above the door of Monroe's dress and fabric shop had not rung in 3 days when a cowboy walked in smelling of trail dust, leather, and something undeniably hopeful, and asked Henrietta Monroe for something worthy of the bravest woman he had ever met. It was the autumn of 1882, in the sun-scorched, wind-scraped town of Caldwell, Kansas, a place that sat right at the edge of the Kishom Trail like a man who could not decide whether to step forward or turn back. Caldwell was a cattle town through and through, the kind of place where the saloons outnumbered the churches by a wide margin and the dust never truly settled, not even on the Sabbath. It was a place of hard men, harder women, and the constant sound of hooves in commerce, and the distant low moan of the prairie wind pressing itself against every window frame in town. Henrietta Monroe had lived in Caldwell for 4 years, having come from St. Louis with her mother and a wagon-load of fabric, thread, and ambition after her father died of consumption, and left them with nothing but a small inheritance and the clothes on their backs. She had been 22 then, sharp-eyed and quick-handed with a needle, and she had built the dress shop from a rented corner of a dry goods store into its own proper establishment on Commerce Street, complete with a painted sign and a glass window that she washed herself every Tuesday and Friday morning without fail. Her mother, Oliver Monroe, had helped for 2 years before her own health began to fail, and now Oliver lived in the rooms above the shop, while Henrietta managed everything below. At 26, Henrietta was known in Caldwell as the woman who could make anyone look like someone worth noticing. She had made ball gowns for the wives of cattle barons and simple cotton dresses for the wives of homesteaders who paid in eggs and corn if they paid at all. She had a mouth that said exactly what she thought, hands that were always either threading a needle or holding a measuring tape, and dark auburn hair that she kept pinned up with a discipline that occasionally slipped by late afternoon, letting strands fall loose around her jaw in a way that her mother said made her look approachable, and that Henrietta herself called untidy. She had turned down 2 proposals of marriage, one from a land surveyor named Aldous Perkins, who smelled of pipe tobacco and condescension, and one from the deputy sheriff, whose name she could not now recall without effort, which she had always taken as a sign that she had made the right decision. She was bent over a bolt of deep blue calico on the morning of October the 9th when the bell above the door rang and Oliver Bancroft walked in. He was not what she expected, though she could not have said what she expected exactly. He was tall, probably 6 feet, and perhaps a little more, with the kind of build that comes from years of physical labor rather than any deliberate effort at it. He had brown hair that wanted cutting, a jaw that had not seen a razor in at least 3 days, and eyes that were a shade of green she had not encountered before, something between the color of sage and the color of a river running shallow over stones. He wore a dusty brown hat that he took off the moment he stepped inside, which she noted immediately, and which elevated her opinion of him before he had spoken a single word. His coat was a working man's coat, well worn at the elbows, and his boots were the boots of someone who had covered serious ground in them. He stood in the doorway for a moment, holding his hat in both hands, looking around the shop with the slightly bewildered expression of a man who had perhaps never been inside a dress shop in his life and was only now reckoning with what that meant. "Good morning," Henrietta said, straightening and setting down her shears. "Can I help you with something?" He looked at her directly, and there was something in that look that was not flirtatious or calculating or any of the things that men's looks in Caldwell tended to be. It was simply honest, the way a man looks when he is trying to figure out whether the person in front of him is the right person to trust with something that matters. "I hope so," he said. His voice was low and unhurried, and he had a slight Texas cadence to it. "I am looking for a dress, something fine, something," he paused and turned the brim of his hat slowly in his hands, "something worthy of the bravest woman I have ever met." Henrietta looked at him for a moment. She had heard many reasons for men to enter dress shops over the years. They came in for anniversary gifts and birthday gifts and guilt gifts, and the occasional desperate attempt to mend something they had broken that could not be mended with cloth alone. But she had never heard a man describe what he wanted in quite that way, with quite that seriousness. "Tell me about her," Henrietta said. He blinked as though the question surprised him. "I beg your pardon. The woman the dress is for, tell me about her. I cannot make something worthy of a person I know nothing about." He was quiet for a moment. Then he seemed to make a decision, and he moved forward into the shop, stopping at the counter that separated the front display area from the working space where Henrietta stood. He set his hat on the counter. "Her name is Marguerite Vasquez," he said. "She is 47 years old. She runs a cattle operation about 12 miles south of town, has done since her husband passed 6 years ago. She has 3 sons, all of them grown, all of them working the ranch. She came to Kansas from New Mexico Territory when she was 19 years old with her husband and 12 head of cattle and not much else, and she has built something real out there on that land." He paused. "Last month there was a fire. It started in the hay barn and spread to the main house. She was the last one out. She went back in for a hired hand who could not walk on account of a broken leg he had from a fall 2 weeks prior. Got him out before the roof came down. She was burned on her arms and her hands, not terribly. The doctor says she will be fine, but it will take time." He stopped again, and his jaw tightened slightly in a way that told Henrietta this woman meant something real to him. She lost most everything in that house. Her clothes, her things, her husband's photograph. She has not complained once. Not to me, not to her sons, not to anyone. She just keeps going. He looked at Henrietta with those green eyes. She deserves something beautiful. She has never had anything just because it is beautiful. Everything she owns has always been practical. Henrietta had been listening with the full attention she gave to things that deserved it. "Is she your mother?" she asked. Something moved through his expression, something warm and a little sad at once. "No. My mother died when I was 11, but Marguerite Vasquez is the closest thing I have had to one in the 20 years since." He paused. "I rode with her oldest son, Tomas, for 3 years on the trail. She fed me at her table more times than I can count, treated me like I was one of her own." Henrietta looked at him for a long moment. Then she reached beneath the counter and pulled out her leather-bound notebook, the one where she kept her measurements and notes. "What is her coloring? Her build?" He considered the question seriously, which she appreciated. Most men waved vaguely when asked to describe a woman's appearance, and said things like average or regular-sized. "Dark complexion," he said. "Dark eyes, strong in the way that ranch women are strong, not heavy, not thin. She carries herself upright even now with the burns, about your height I think or close to it, maybe a hair shorter. Her favorite color if you know it." He thought about it. "She always had a blue tablecloth on the kitchen table, always. It was the first thing she replaced after the fire, went into town and bought a new one. Blue, I think." Henrietta made a note. "And the occasion. Is this for no particular occasion, or is there something specific?" "Her youngest son is getting married in December," he said, "in Santa Fe. She is making the journey for it, and she has nothing to wear that is not a work dress. I want her to feel like the woman she is, not the tragedy she has been through." Henrietta stopped writing and looked up at him. There was a quality to what he had just said that she found she could not immediately dismiss or set aside. It was the most articulate description of what a dress was truly for that she had ever heard from anyone, man or woman. "I can make that," she said, and she heard something in her own voice that she had not put there intentionally, a kind of conviction, a kind of gladness. "I will make that." He seemed to exhale slightly, as though he had not been certain she would say yes. "What do you need from me?" "Measurements would be ideal, but since she is not here I will need you to come back. Can you bring her in? Or if she cannot make the trip into town, I can come to her." "She would not come herself," he said. "She is stubborn about accepting things. I am going to tell her sons it is a gift from all of them so she does not refuse it." He paused. "Could you come out to the ranch? I know that is a lot to ask." "I make house calls when the situation warrants it," Henrietta said. "This situation warrants it." He nodded, and something shifted in his expression that was close to relief. "When would you be able to come?" "Saturday morning," she said. "I will need directions." "I can ride with you," he said quickly and then caught himself. "If you would like. The roads are not difficult, but there are a couple of turns that are easy to miss." "That would be acceptable," Henrietta said, with the particular professional neutrality she employed when she was in fact interested in something. "I do not believe I caught your name." "Oliver Bancroft," he said, and he put his hand out across the counter in the way a man extends a hand to another man he is meeting on fair terms, and she shook it. "Henrietta Monroe," she said. "This is my shop." "I can see that," he said, and he smiled for the first time, and it was a good smile, the kind that did not announce itself with great fanfare but arrived and then stayed. "It is a fine shop." She walked him through the preliminary details, the cost, the timeline, the type of fabric she would suggest, and he listened carefully and asked intelligent questions. And by the time he retrieved his hat from the counter and set it back on his head and said goodbye and walked back out through the door, Henrietta was aware of the fact that the shop felt slightly emptier than it had before he arrived, which was a feeling she did not examine closely for the remainder of that day. But she thought about it that evening, sitting in the lamplit kitchen above the shop, while her mother Eleanor dozed in the parlor armchair with a novel splayed open on her lap. Henrietta sat with her own notebook and sketched dresses, rough shapes and fabric ideas for Marguerite Vasquez, and she told herself the persistent warmth she felt was simply the satisfaction of an interesting commission, a project with a real person and a real story behind it, the kind she liked best. She believed this almost entirely. Saturday arrived with a pale yellow sky and a chill in the air that carried the first real hint of the coming Kansas winter. Henrietta was standing in front of the shop at 7:30 with her measuring kit and fabric samples in a leather satchel when Oliver Bancroft rode up on a dark bay horse, and she noted that he was punctual, which she considered one of the more reliable indicators of a person's character. He had cleaned up since she had seen him last. His hat was the same, but his shirt was fresh and his jaw was shaved smooth, and she was aware, in a way she found slightly irritating, that he was a very good-looking man when the trail dust was not sitting on top of it. He had brought a second horse, a calm-tempered roan, already saddled for her. She was a competent rider, having learned in the practical way of women who lived in cattle country, and she mounted without assistance, which seemed to please him in a quiet way that he did not comment on. They rode south out of Caldwell into the open country, and the prairie spread itself out around them in every direction, vast and amber in the October morning, the sky above it enormous and blue, and Henrietta felt, as she always did when she rode out beyond the town's borders, that particular mixture of smallness and freedom that the prairie alone produced in her. Oliver rode beside her and they talked, not with the awkward performance of people who are trying to make an impression, but with the comfortable candor of people who have, without quite knowing when it happened, already made them. He told her about himself in an unself-conscious way, how he had grown up in the hill country of Texas, the son of a rancher who had lost the ranch to drought and debt by the time Oliver was 16. He had been cowboying since, following the cattle drives north along the Kisham Trail, working various outfits through his early 20s, until he had gotten himself a small piece of land north of Caldwell 2 years ago and was now building a cattle operation of his own, small but honest, as he put it. "What made you stop trailing and start settling?" she asked, and it was a genuine question, not a social one. He was quiet for a moment, watching the horizon. "I suppose I got tired of moving towards something that was always somewhere else," he said. "The trail is its own kind of life, and it suits some men their whole years. But I got to wanting something that stayed in one place. Something you could come back to." "Like what?" she asked. He glanced at her sideways, and there was something in the glance that made her breath do something unusual and unwelcome. "I am still working that part out," he said, and looked back at the horizon. They arrived at the Vasquez ranch not long after, a working operation spread across good flat land with a new barn that still smelled of fresh lumber and a main house that had clearly been recently rebuilt, the walls pale and unpainted, the windows without curtains, the rawness of loss written into the construction itself. Marguerite Vasquez met them in the yard. She was exactly as Oliver had described, a woman of compact, upright dignity, with dark eyes that assessed everything quickly and a face that held its composure with the practiced ease of someone who had long ago decided that composure was a resource that could not be squandered. Her arms were wrapped in light cotton bandaging where the burns were still healing. When she understood what Oliver had brought Henrietta for, her expression went through several things rapidly: surprise, resistance, something that might have been grief if it had been allowed to fully arrive, and then a kind of careful gratitude that she wore as if it were armor and warmth simultaneously. "This is not necessary," she told Oliver with the certainty of a woman who was accustomed to her decisions being final. "No," he agreed, "it is not necessary. It is simply true." Marguerite looked at him for a long moment and then she looked at Henrietta. "He has always been like this," she said to Henrietta, as though they shared some long-standing understanding. "Stubborn in the kindest way possible." "I find that to be a useful kind of stubborn," Henrietta said, and Marguerite's mouth curved slightly, and they understood each other at once in the way that women sometimes do, cutting through the formality with a single shared observation. Henrietta spent an hour with Marguerite, taking measurements with her long tape and asking quiet questions and listening to the answers. She showed the fabric samples and watched Marguerite's hands move over them, noting which ones she lingered on even when she said she had no preference. She was drawn to the deep blue silk, just as Oliver's instinct about the tablecloth had suggested, and also to a rich burgundy wool that Henrietta had brought on impulse, and which now seemed exactly right. "2 dresses," Henrietta said. "1 is more than enough," Marguerite said. "I know," Henrietta said. "But the blue silk is for the wedding and the burgundy wool is for every morning after that when you want to feel like yourself again." Marguerite was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You are good at your work." "Yes," Henrietta said simply. "I am." When they left the ranch, the sun was already past its high point and the day had warmed into something golden and good. They rode back toward Caldwell at an easy pace, and neither of them was in a particular hurry, and Henrietta noticed this about herself and chose, for once, not to interrogate it. Oliver told her about the first cattle drive he had ridden at 16, a boy alone in a sea of grown men and longhorns and dust, and she told him about the first dress she had ever made entirely on her own, at age 14, for her older cousin's engagement party, and how she had sewn the sleeves on backward and had to take the whole bodice apart and start over at 2 in the morning the night before the party. "Did it come out right?" he asked. "It was the best dress anyone wore at that party," she said, with the easy confidence of someone recounting an old victory. "I made sure of it." He laughed, and it was a genuine laugh, unguarded, and she liked the sound of it very much and filed this fact away in the part of herself that kept track of things she liked without always admitting why. He accompanied her to the door of her shop when they returned and stood on the boardwalk with his hat in his hands again, and she recognized this as a habit of his, removing his hat when he was being sincere. "Thank you," he said, "for making the trip and for the way you treated her. She is not easy with kindness, you made it easy." "It was not difficult," Henrietta said. "She is worth the effort." "Yes," he said and looked at her directly, "she is." He asked, with a careful neutrality that she recognized because she employed it herself, whether it might be acceptable for him to come by the shop in a week to see how the work was progressing. She said that would be fine. He put his hat back on, nodded once in that straightforward way of his, and walked back to where the horses were tied and rode away. Henrietta stood on the boardwalk for a moment in the October afternoon and looked at the empty street and admitted to herself, with the same clean honesty she gave her other work, that she was looking forward to next week. She was also going to make the most beautiful dresses she had ever made. She began on the blue silk that same evening, laying it out across the long work table in the back of the shop after she had locked the front door and eaten supper with her mother. Eleanor had a way of watching Henrietta work that was quiet and attentive, and she had been watching this evening from the settee near the window with her mending in her lap when she said, without looking up, "The man who came in. What is his story?" "He is buying dresses for a woman who lost her belongings in a fire," Henrietta said, not looking up from her cutting. Eleanor said, "That is a good deed." "Yes," Henrietta agreed, "good looking." Eleanor asked, with the serene neutrality of a woman who knows exactly what she is doing. "Mother," Henrietta said. "A simple question," Eleanor said, and turned to him. Henrietta did not answer, which her mother accepted as the answer it was. Oliver came by the following Friday, rather than in a week as he had said, which was only 6 days later, and was therefore close enough to be considered within the range he had stated. And she found herself noting this small discrepancy with something that was definitely not pleased. He stood at the counter while she showed him the work in progress, the blue silk cut and basted into shape, the burgundy wool partially sewn, and he looked at the fabric and the stitching with a focus that suggested he was genuinely trying to understand what he was seeing rather than simply performing interest. "She is going to be upset when she finds out I was involved," he said. "She is going to feel beautiful," Henrietta said. "That will outweigh the upset." "You are confident," he said. "I am accurate," she said. He stayed longer than a dress consultation required. They talked about the town, about the cattle business, about the winter coming and what it meant for operations in the region. She made coffee on the small stove in the back room because the afternoon had turned cold, and he accepted it without the self-consciousness of a man who was aware that a woman had made him coffee in her private space, which meant he was either oblivious or comfortable, and from everything she had observed about him, she suspected it was the latter, and she found she preferred that. He came again the following Friday, and the Friday after that, and each time he came, the dress consultation occupied perhaps 10 minutes of the time he was there, and the rest was something else, something that had its own shape and weight, and that neither of them had yet named. They talked about books, and she was surprised and pleased to find that he read, having a habit of carrying a novel in his saddlebag when he was on the trail, and he was surprised and pleased to find that she had opinions about everything, which she did. He told her things about his life that felt like the things a person tells when they are no longer performing for an audience, but simply talking to someone they trust. He told her about the loneliness of the trail, not the romantic loneliness that men sometimes boasted about, but the actual ache of it, the years of eating at other people's tables and sleeping under other people's skies and waking up in places where no one knew your name the previous season. He told her he had wanted to be a school teacher when he was young, before the ranch failed and the trail became the only available road, and she saw on his face when he said it the expression of someone revisiting a fork they had taken long ago and wondering about the path not chosen. "It is not too late," she said. "I am 30 years old," he said. "I know," she said. "That is not old." He looked at her with those green eyes. "No," he said slowly. "I suppose it is not." On the fourth Friday, he brought her a book. It was a copy of George Eliot's Middlemarch, a little worn at the spine, and he put it on the counter with a casualness that did not quite succeed in hiding the care behind the gesture. "I thought you might not have this one," he said. She picked it up and ran her thumb along the spine. She did not have this one. "Thank you," she said, and looked at him. "You are welcome," he said, and something in the air between them had shifted again, moved a step closer to something, and they both knew it, and they both, by some mutual unspoken agreement, let it settle there for the moment without pressing it further. It was her mother who pressed it. Eleanor came downstairs one evening after Oliver had visited and sat with the distinct energy of a woman who had been patient long enough. She sat in the chair by the window and looked at Henrietta and said, "He is in love with you." "Mother," Henrietta said, not looking up from her sewing. He looks at you the way your father looked at me before he told me, Oliver said. I know that look. It is unmistakable. He comes here about a dress commission, Henrietta said. The dresses have been finished for 2 weeks, Oliver said. He has come by 3 times since then. Henrietta put down her needle. Her mother was not wrong about this. The dresses had been completed, and she had delivered them to Marguerite Vasquez herself, riding out with Oliver, who had volunteered as escort again. And Marguerite had put on the blue silk in her new bedroom in the new house, and stood before the small mirror on the dresser, and been very still and very quiet for a long moment. And then she had turned around and looked at Henrietta and said, "This is the finest thing I have ever owned," with a directness that had the quality of something sacred. She had looked at Oliver then and said, "You chose well," and Oliver had looked at Henrietta, and the look was not about Marguerite's dress. Henrietta had known then. She had simply been managing it carefully. "He may be interested," she said to her mother now with precision. "And I may be," she paused. "You may be," Oliver prompted. "I am not in the habit of making decisions quickly," Henrietta said. "I know," Oliver said. "You have been deciding about this man for 6 weeks. "That is not very long," Henrietta said. "Henrietta," her mother said gently, "you turned down Aldous Perkins after 2 years and the deputy after 18 months. You have known for 6 weeks what you already knew the day that man walked in here with his hat in his hands and asked for something worthy of the bravest woman he had ever met. You know your own mind." Henrietta sat with this for a moment. Outside, the November wind was moving through Caldwell, rattling the window in its frame. "He has not said anything," she said. "Then perhaps," her mother said, with the tranquility of a woman who has been right about many things for many years, "you should give him the opportunity." Oliver came by the following Wednesday, which was not a Friday, which meant something. He came in at mid-morning when the shop was quiet, and he had clearly ridden in specifically for this purpose. And he stood at the counter and began talking about something Henrietta could see he did not particularly care about: the weather, the price of feed, whether the first snowfall would come early this year. And she let him talk for a moment, and then she set down her shears and looked at him directly. "Oliver," she said. He stopped talking and looked at her. "Why do you come here?" she asked. Not unkindly, simply directly. He was quiet for a long moment. The wind pressed against the window. Somewhere down the street, a horse was being reshod, the rhythmic ring of hammer on iron coming through the walls. "I think you know why," he said. "I want to hear it," she said. He looked at her with those green eyes and took a breath and said, "Because this is the best part of my week. Because you are the most interesting, capable, honest person I have met in this town or any town, and I have been in a great many towns. Because I came in here 6 weeks ago with my hat in my hands and a commission for a dress, and I walked out thinking about you in a way I have not thought about anyone in a very long time." He paused. "And because I would very much like to take you to dinner at the hotel dining room this Saturday evening if you are willing, and if not dinner, then whatever you would prefer. And if not that, then I will accept the correction and find another way to demonstrate that my intentions are serious and respectful." Henrietta looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "Saturday at 6 o'clock. I will meet you out front." Something in his face opened up like a window being unlatched. "6 o'clock," he said. "Yes," she said, and picked up her shears again, and smiled at the calico in front of her, and did not look up, and heard him say goodbye with a warmth in his voice that she carried with her for the rest of that day like something tucked against her chest. Saturday dinner at the Caldwell Hotel was a proper affair. The dining room lit with oil lamps, and set with white tablecloths that Henrietta suspected she could have sewn better herself, but that did the job adequately. They ate roasted beef and bread, and Henrietta had a small glass of wine that she sipped slowly, and Oliver had a coffee, and they talked for 2 hours with the ease of people who have already done the difficult work of knowing each other, and are now simply enjoying the knowing. He told her the full story of his land north of town, 40 acres that he was slowly developing, a proper house half built, a small herd of cattle that he was growing year by year, and the picture he described was one of deliberate, patient construction rather than the grand cattle baron ambitions that many men in Caldwell seemed to carry. He was building something modest and real, and the modesty of it appealed to Henrietta in a way that the grand ambitions never had. She told him about her plans for the shop, about the possibility of taking on an apprentice in the spring, a young woman of 17 who had been coming in asking questions with a focused hunger that Henrietta recognized as the same hunger she had felt at that age. She told him about the letter she had received from a fabric merchant in Kansas City about a new line of imported cloth from Europe, and the dresses she had already designed in her head to go with it. "You are going to be famous," he said, and he meant it without irony. "In Caldwell, Kansas, I already am," she said, and they both laughed, and it was the laugh of two people who are very comfortable with each other, which is a different and better thing than the laughter of two people who are trying to be. He walked her back to the shop after dinner, and they stood on the boardwalk in the cold November night, and Caldwell was quiet around them, the saloon sounds muffled down the block, the stars above the town hard and brilliant in the way they are in the high plains in November. "I had a very good evening," he said. "So did I," she said. He looked at her for a moment and then he said, "I would like to do this again, many times." "Is that something you would be interested in?" "Yes," she said. "Many times sounds exactly right." He smiled at that good unhurried smile, and he took her hand and held it for a moment in both of his, and then he said good night and walked back toward where his horse was stabled for the evening, and she went inside and stood in the dark of the shop for a moment, feeling the warm shape of what was beginning. November in Caldwell had its hardships. The cold came in seriously, the kind that got into the bones of the buildings and the people in them, and the trail-driven commerce that kept the town alive in summer and fall slowed to a more grinding pace. Henrietta kept the shop warm with a stove that she fed with wood every morning and evening, and she worked on a set of winter commissions, warm wool dresses and cloaks, and the kind of practical winter garments that the women of Caldwell needed to survive the season with both warmth and dignity intact. Oliver came to see her 3 times a week now, sometimes in the morning before his work on the ranch, sometimes in the evenings after, and occasionally they went somewhere, to the hotel dining room again, or to the church social that happened on the second Saturday of November, where Oliver stood beside her and was unfailingly polite to everyone who came to talk to her, and made her laugh quietly twice during the preacher's announcements. And she decided that evening with some certainty that she was falling in love with him. She did not say this out loud yet, because she was Henrietta Monroe, and she said things when she was certain, not when she was merely almost certain. But she was almost certain, and she was moving steadily in the direction of the rest of it. There was a difficulty she had not anticipated, which arose in the middle of November and which had nothing romantic about it. A man named Cyrus Holt, who owned a large cattle operation south of Caldwell, and who had a way of acquiring things he wanted through means that the law was aware of but had not yet successfully acted upon, had been trying for 2 years to purchase the building that housed Monroe's dress and fabric shop. He wanted the entire block on Commerce Street, intending to put up a warehouse, and he had been buying buildings along it one by one. He had come to Henrietta twice before with offers that she had declined, and she had thought, after the second refusal, that the matter was settled. She discovered in mid-November that it was not. The building's owner, a man named Garvey who lived in Wichita and rented the space to her, sent her a letter informing her that he had sold the building to Cyrus Holt effective January the 1st of the coming year, and that under the terms of her lease she had 60 days' notice, which he was providing. The letter was polite and apologetic and entirely unhelpful. Henrietta read it standing at the counter on a Tuesday morning and felt the cold clarity of a real problem settling itself into her chest. She had the money for a new space. She had been careful with it, saving with deliberate purpose since the first year she had opened, the way her mother had taught her to save, a portion of every payment set aside with the discipline of someone who did not assume security but built it. She could afford to buy a building outright, perhaps not on Commerce Street, which had become expensive, but somewhere in Caldwell that was viable. The problem was time. Finding a suitable space, negotiating a purchase, arranging the move, rebuilding her established presence, and ensuring her regular customers knew where to find her. All of this in 60 days while the winter was at its hardest and her order books were full, was a serious undertaking. She told Oliver that evening when he came by and found her at the counter with papers and figures spread around her. She had not planned to tell him, not because she wanted to hide it from him, but because she was accustomed to managing her own difficulties, and she was in the middle of mapping the solution when he walked in and read her face immediately. "What is the matter?" he asked. She told him. She told him all of it calmly and completely because that was how she handled things. He listened without interrupting, which she appreciated. When she had finished, he was quiet for a moment, his hat in his hands. Then he said, "What do you need?" "I need a good building for sale in this town that is appropriate for a dress shop," she said. "I have been through the Caldwell register of properties in my head, and I can think of 3 possibilities. One on Prairie Street, one on Main, and the old Morrison building on 2nd. All 3 have problems, but all 3 are workable." "I know the Morrison building," he said. "The back room has water damage." "I know," she said. "But the front room is good and the upper floor is intact and the price will reflect the damage." "Come with me tomorrow morning," he said. "I want to walk through it with you. I do not know buildings the way I know horses and land, but I know enough to help you see it clearly." She looked at him. "You do not have to. I know I do not have to," he said, with a patience that did not argue, that simply stated, "I want to." They went the next morning, and he walked through the Morrison building with her, and said useful things about the structure and the floor and the roof. And he knew a carpenter in town who he spoke to that same afternoon, and the carpenter confirmed that the water damage was repairable for a cost that, combined with the building's reduced price, still left Henrietta within her means. She made an offer on the Morrison building by the end of the week. It was accepted. And Oliver and Tomas Vasquez and 2 other men she knew by reputation appeared on a Saturday in December to begin the moving of the heavy furniture and equipment from the old shop to the new. And Henrietta stood in the middle of all of it, directing with the authority of someone conducting an operation she had planned in thorough detail, which she had. "You are the most organized woman I have ever encountered in my life," Oliver said to her during a pause, sitting on the stairs in the new building with a cup of coffee she had brought from the neighboring bakery. "I had to be," she said, sitting beside him. "No one was going to organize it for me." He looked at her profile. "I know," he said. "And that is admirable, but," he paused carefully, "it is also all right to let people help you sometimes." "I am letting people help me today," she pointed out. "You are accepting help today," he said. "That is not quite the same thing as letting it." She considered this. It was true in the way that certain true things are slightly uncomfortable. "I am working on that," she admitted. "I know," he said, and put his hand over hers on the step, and they sat like that for a moment in the half-settled chaos of the move, and she thought, with a fullness that she could no longer attribute to anything other than what it was, that she was entirely in love with this man. She said nothing of this on the stairs, but she did not move her hand. The new shop was open before Christmas, and it was better than the old one in the ways that mattered, which was to say that it was hers, the deed in her name, no landlord in Wichita to be persuaded by Cyrus Holt or anyone else. She had repaired the back room herself, with the carpenter, and she had painted the front room a deep cream color and rehung her sign and washed the new windows on the first Tuesday. She was officially open, and felt a satisfaction that was cleaner and more complete than anything she had felt about the old shop, because this one was built on something permanent. Oliver came in on the first morning of official opening and set a small cactus in a terracotta pot on the counter. "What is this?" she asked. "A housewarming gift," he said. It is resilient and does not require excessive attention, and I thought you would appreciate those qualities." She looked at the small cactus and then at him. "Are you comparing me to a cactus?" "I am comparing you to something that survives and thrives in difficult conditions and is, when you look closely, more beautiful than the landscape suggests," he said. "Yes." She picked up the cactus and placed it on the windowsill where the light was best. "I am going to keep this," she said. "I know," he said. December in Caldwell was cold and clear and busy with the commerce of Christmas, and Henrietta was producing her finest work, the holiday orders keeping her sewing until late every night by lamplight, her mother upstairs keeping the fire, and sometimes bringing down tea without being asked. Oliver came and went, helping with the practical business of establishing the new shop, collecting a shelf she had ordered from the carpenter, picking up a delivery of thread and notions from the general store when she was too pressed to leave the workroom. He was becoming woven into the daily life of the shop, and of her life with such naturalness that it was only when she stood back mentally and looked at it that she understood how significant that was. She understood it most clearly one evening in the middle of December when she looked up from her work to find him sitting in the reading chair she had put in the front room for customers, and he had a book open and was reading with the lamp beside him, and her mother was in the other chair across from him with her own book, and the two of them were sitting in companionable silence like people who belonged in the same room. And Henrietta stood in the doorway to the workroom and watched this for a moment with a feeling in her chest that she had no word for except fullness. She went back to her sewing, but she was smiling. Christmas came, and with it the arrival in town of Tomas Vasquez and his two brothers, coming through Caldwell on their way to fetch their mother for the journey to Santa Fe for the youngest brother's wedding. They stopped at the shop to thank Henrietta for the dresses, and Tomas Vasquez was a broad-shouldered, dark-eyed man of 32 with his mother's directness and his own easy warmth, and he shook Henrietta's hand and said, "You made my mother feel like herself again. That is not something I can repay." "It is paid for already," Henrietta said. "Come back and tell me how the wedding went." Oliver stood with his hand on Tomas's shoulder, and there was between the two men the ease of a long friendship. And Henrietta watched them and thought about the network of loyalty and care that Oliver had built in the world without quite seeming to be building anything. And she thought that this was one of his finest qualities, that goodness that was structural rather than performative. After the Vasquez brothers rode on, Oliver stood in the cold street outside the shop and said, without particular prelude, "I would like to ask you something." "All right," she said. He had his hat in his hands. "I would like to ask you to come and see the ranch, the house, what I am building. I would like you to see it." He paused. "Not for any purpose other than I would like to share it with you, but I think you should know what I am building and where I am building it." Given that, he stopped. "Given that what?" she asked. He looked at her steadily. "Given that I am hoping, when the time is right and when you tell me you are ready, to ask you something much more significant." Henrietta's heart performed a maneuver she chose not to catalogue in detail. She looked at him in the winter sunlight of the Caldwell street and said, "I would like to see it very much." They rode out to the ranch on a Sunday morning in late December when the sky was the color of tin and the grass was silver with frost. The 40 acres spread around them in the pale light, the land gentle and flat and promising in the way of land that has not yet been made into everything it could be. The house was half built, the frame solid and the walls up, the roof on, but the inside unfinished, empty rooms waiting for someone to decide what they would become. Oliver walked her through it room by room, and she saw what he saw, not the incompleteness but the shape of what was coming, the kitchen that would face east for the morning light, the parlor that was large enough for a proper gathering, the room off the hallway that he said with a careful casualness could be many things depending on what was needed. "It is good land," she said. "Good bones." "Yes," he said. "I think so." "The kitchen window should be bigger," she said. "East-facing is right, but you want enough light to work by in the afternoon, too. You could extend the west wall a foot and put a second window there." He looked at the wall she indicated. "You are right," he said, and he sounded delighted in a way that was entirely disproportionate to the suggestion, as though she had handed him something rare. "I had not thought of that. I spend a great deal of time thinking about windows," she said. "I will keep that in mind," he said. They stood in the unfinished kitchen in the December cold and looked at the space around them, and it was possible, standing there, to imagine the room finished and warm and used. And Henrietta was doing this imagining in a way that included herself in it, and she thought Oliver probably knew this, because he was perceptive in the careful way of someone who listens more than they speak. "Henrietta," he said. "Yes," she said. "I'm not going to ask you yet," he said, "because I told you I would ask when you were ready, and I do not think you have quite said so. But I want you to know that everything I am building here, I am building with you in mind, with the possibility of you, and that whatever you decide, I am certain that knowing you has made me a better version of myself than I was before." She looked at him for a long time. The frost on the grass outside the unfinished window caught the pale light. "Oliver," she said. "Yes, I am ready," she said. He went very still. "You are certain?" "I have been certain since the Morrison Building stairs," she said. "I was simply being thorough." He crossed the space between them in a way that was unhurried and entirely deliberate, and he took her face in his hands with the same careful directness he applied to everything else in his life, and he kissed her in the unfinished kitchen of the half-built house on the frozen Kansas prairie. And it was the best kiss of her life, not because it was technically remarkable, but because it was completely and irrevocably true. When he pulled back, he was looking at her with an expression she had never seen on him before and that she understood immediately was something he did not show to many people. "Marry me," he said. "Yes," she said, not slowly, not after consideration. Just yes, clean and whole. The winter pulled itself out around them like a long, deep breath, and Caldwell came into January of 1883 with its usual cold practicality, and Henrietta Monroe continued to run her shop and plan her wedding simultaneously, which anyone who knew her would have told you was exactly the kind of challenge she was built for. She made her own dress, naturally. She would not have had it any other way, and no one in Caldwell suggested otherwise, because everyone in Caldwell had enough sense for that. She made it from ivory silk that she had ordered from Kansas City in October, before she had known anything about Oliver Bancroft, and she had kept it on the shelf for a commission she had not yet identified, and she understood now that she had been keeping it for this. The dress was the best thing she had ever made. She knew this without arrogance, in the way that a craftsperson knows when their work has exceeded their previous best. It was a simple silhouette, because she had always found that simplicity in a wedding dress achieved something that embellishment only attempted, but the stitching was elaborate and perfect. The bodice fitted with a precision that no one but another seamstress would fully understand, and the skirt fell with the kind of weight and movement that silk achieves when it is cut exactly right. Her mother wept when she tried it on for the first time, standing in the workroom in the January light, and Oliver Monroe was not a woman who wept easily. "Your father would have been so proud," Oliver said. "Of all of it, the shop, the building, you," she paused, "and the man is a good one." "I know," Henrietta said, looking at herself in the long mirror she had propped against the workroom wall. "I checked." Oliver laughed through her tears. "Of course you did." Oliver, for his part, was navigating his own version of the preparations with the steady good humor that Henrietta had come to understand was one of his foundational qualities. He finished the house, hiring the carpenter to complete the interior through January, and he consulted Henrietta on every decision with a seriousness that was both flattering and entirely appropriate, because she had opinions and they were good ones. The second window in the kitchen was installed on the western wall, just as she had suggested, and the light in that room on the late winter afternoons was exactly what she had known it would be. Marguerite Vasquez came back through Caldwell in January on her way back from Santa Fe, the wedding completed, and she stopped to see Henrietta and Oliver together, and she sat at the table in the room above the dress shop with Oliver Monroe, and the two older women regarded each other with the mutual respect of people who have both built things under difficult conditions. And then Marguerite looked at Oliver and Henrietta and said, "Good. I am glad." And then she looked at Oliver specifically and said, "She is the right one, I hope you know that." "I have known it since October," Oliver said. "Men," Marguerite said to Alina with the philosophical resignation of someone who has spent many decades observing them, "they always know things last." "That is not entirely fair," Oliver said. "I walked into her shop 6 weeks after I arrived in Caldwell. That is not slow." "You walked into her shop for a dress," Henrietta said. "I walked into her shop," Oliver said, with a precision that was deliberate, "because I heard someone in the hotel mention the best dressmaker in Caldwell, and I needed a dress for the bravest woman I had ever met. The fact that I found two remarkable women in the same transaction should be counted as remarkable luck, not slowness." There was a pause, and then all four of them laughed, and the sound of it in the warm room above the dress shop on the cold January evening was one of those sounds that a life is made of. The wedding was in February, on a clear cold Saturday when the snow that had been threatening for a week had still not come, as though the weather had decided to hold off out of consideration. The ceremony was at the small Methodist church on Main Street, performed by the Reverend Hayes, who was a practical man who kept his ceremony dignified and sincere without being excessive, which was exactly what Henrietta had requested when she had gone to discuss the matter with him in January. The church was full. Henrietta had more friends in Caldwell than she sometimes acknowledged. The women who had brought her their fabric and their hopes over 4 years, the ranchers' wives and the merchants' wives and the homesteaders' wives, and the women who ran their own businesses in the way that the frontier permitted women to do in ways that the East had not yet caught up with. They came and they sat and they watched Henrietta Monroe walk down the aisle of the Methodist church in her ivory silk dress with the precise stitching and the perfectly weighted skirt, and they understood that they were watching something that was exactly right. Oliver stood at the front of the church in a dark suit that he had clearly just purchased and had pressed with great care, and he had his hat off, naturally, holding it at his side, and when she reached him and he looked at her, the expression on his face was the one she had seen in the unfinished kitchen in December, the private one, the real one. "You made that dress," he said quietly as she took her place beside him. "Of course I did," she said. "It is extraordinary," he said. "I know," she said. Reverend Hayes cleared his throat gently and they turned to face him and the ceremony began. The vows were straightforward and meant completely. Oliver Bancroft said his with the directness of a man who does not use words he does not intend, looking at her the whole time with those green eyes, and Henrietta Monroe said hers with a clarity and steadiness that caused at least 3 of the women in the pews to require their handkerchiefs. They were married by mid-morning, and the rest of that Saturday was a celebration at the hotel, where the dining room had been opened for the occasion, and there was food and music, and the kind of talking that happens when a community gathers around something good and lets itself be glad. Marguerite Vasquez was there, having stayed in Caldwell for the occasion, wearing the burgundy wool dress, and she looked exactly as Henrietta had said she would, like herself again, upright and dignified and present, and she sat at the table of honor beside Oliver Monroe, and the two of them talked for most of the afternoon with the ease of a friendship that had begun in January and would clearly last. Tomas Vasquez danced with the blacksmith's daughter twice and was seen looking slightly dazed about this, which several people noted with interest. But that is another story. Oliver danced with Henrietta twice, and then stood beside her for the rest of the afternoon with his hand at the small of her back in a way that was both proprietary and gentle, and she leaned against that hand without particularly intending to. And they talked to their guests and accepted congratulations and ate and laughed, and at one point stood together in the corner of the room for a quiet minute, while the music played and the conversation swelled around them. And he looked at her and she looked at him, and nothing needed to be said. They moved into the house on the ranch in March, when the weather had gentled enough to make the move comfortable. Eleanor stayed in the rooms above the shop, which suited her better than the open country, and Henrietta rode into town 4 days a week to manage the shop, which was a practical arrangement that everyone accepted as entirely normal, because in 1883 on the Kansas frontier, women who ran businesses continued to do so after marriage, particularly when they were Henrietta Monroe. The house was everything it had been in the unfinished skeleton of December. It was warm and clean, and full of the particular quality of a place that has been built carefully, with intention. The kitchen had both windows, and the light in the late afternoon was gold and long across the floor, and Henrietta stood in it the first full morning she was there, and felt the satisfaction of having arrived somewhere she had been heading without quite knowing it. She brought the little cactus from the shop and put it on the kitchen windowsill. Oliver saw it there on the second morning and smiled. Spring came slowly, and then all at once, the way Kansas springs do, and the land around the ranch came alive with the particular green of the prairie in April, that brilliant brief green before the summer dried it back to gold and amber. Oliver expanded the herd and Henrietta expanded the shop, taking on the young apprentice she had been considering, a girl of 17 named Clara Hinds, who came in every morning with that same focused hunger and learned quickly and asked good questions and reminded Henrietta very much of herself at that age. "You were exactly like this," Oliver said one evening when Henrietta told him about Clara's progress. "I still am," Henrietta said. "Yes," he agreed completely. That is not a criticism. The summer of 1883 was a busy one, both on the ranch and in the shop. The cattle business was good, and Oliver worked long days through the summer heat, and Henrietta worked long days in the shop, and the evenings on the ranch were the reward of both of their labors, sitting on the porch in the summer dark after supper, talking about the day and the work and the thousand things that two people who are genuinely interested in each other find to talk about indefinitely. They talked about the injustices of the world too, because they were thinking people and the world they lived in contained injustices that were impossible to ignore. They talked about the treatment of the Plains tribes, whose lands had been taken by a series of broken treaties and military campaigns that Oliver had witnessed portions of in his years on the trail, and that he spoke about with a quiet anger that was the appropriate response to what had happened. They talked about the women in Caldwell who had no legal rights to property in their own names, unless they were widowed or had special arrangements, which Henrietta had navigated through the particular combination of competence and stubbornness that had always been her primary tools. They talked about the men who came to Caldwell poor and desperate from failed farms and factories back east, looking for something the frontier had mostly stopped promising. They were not naive people, and they did not pretend that the world around them was uniformly good, but they faced it together, and that made the facing of it bearable and sometimes even useful. In September of 1883, Henrietta told Oliver that she was expecting a child. She told him in the kitchen, in the evening after supper, standing at the stove with her back to him, because she had found that it was sometimes easier to say large things when she was facing away from the person she was saying them to. She said it simply, as she said everything, and there was a moment of silence behind her that she could not read, and then she heard him set down whatever he was holding and cross the kitchen floor, and he turned her around gently by the shoulders and looked at her face. "Are you well?" he asked first, which was exactly the right thing to ask. "I am very well," she said. His expression was one she had not seen before, and it was one of the most open things she had ever witnessed on another person's face. "I am," he stopped. "Henrietta, I am." He shook his head as though the English language had temporarily become inadequate. "I know," she said, and put her hand against his jaw. "I am too." He brought her forehead to his, and they stood like that in the kitchen for a moment in the lamplight with the September dark outside the windows. He wrote a letter to Marguerite Vasquez the next day, and the one she sent back was brief and perfect. "I knew before either of you. Congratulations. Eleanor must be over the moon. Give the child a name with some weight to it." Eleanor Monroe was, in fact, over the moon, and she came out to the ranch the following Sunday and sat with Henrietta on the porch, and held her hand and talked about the future with the kind of hopeful detail that the presence of a new generation allows. Henrietta continued to work through her pregnancy with the modification that Clara was now handling more of the physical management of the shop, proving herself thoroughly capable in the process. Henrietta designed and supervised with the comfortable authority of someone who has fully delegated what she has decided to delegate, and Clara responded to the trust with the kind of concentrated effort that confirmed what Henrietta had always suspected, that the girl had the gift. The baby arrived on the 2nd of April, 1884, in the bedroom of the ranch house that had the eastern window, in the early morning before the sun was fully up, assisted by the town doctor and Eleanor Monroe, who proved in the crisis of the moment to have reserves of calm and practical knowledge that her daughter had always suspected, but never had occasion to verify. It was a boy. Oliver was in the kitchen, having been informed with some firmness by both the doctor and Eleanor that he was not needed in the bedroom, and he had been in the kitchen for 4 hours, making coffee. He did not drink, and staring at the wall with the particular expression of a person who is in the grip of something entirely outside their control. When the doctor came to the kitchen door and said it was done and both were well, Oliver made a sound that he would later describe, with characteristic understatement, as the most relieved he had ever been in his life. They named the boy Samuel. Samuel Monroe Bancroft, carrying both their names, which they had agreed on in January when they were choosing names in the evenings, Henrietta with her notebook and Oliver with his coffee, working through the possibilities with the same careful thoughtfulness they brought to everything. Samuel was a dark-haired, loud-lunged child who arrived in the world with a disposition that suggested he had opinions about things and intended to communicate them, and Oliver held him on the afternoon of the day he was born with an expression on his face that Henrietta, watching from the bed, thought was the single most wonderful thing she had ever seen. "Hello," Oliver said to the baby in his low, unhurried voice. Samuel looked at him with the unfocused intensity of the very newly born and made a small sound. "He is listening to you," Henrietta said. "He is wondering who is speaking to him," Oliver said. "Hello, Samuel, I am your father. I intend to do my best by you. Your mother already does everything better than me, so you are in excellent hands." "That is not true," Henrietta said. "It is almost entirely true," Oliver said, and looked at her over the baby's head with that private expression, and she felt the fullness again, the same one she had been feeling since the stairs of the Morrison building, but deeper now, made more so by the person they had brought into it. The years that followed were the kind that cannot be fully described without reducing them to something smaller than they were, because they were full of ordinary and extraordinary things in the proportion that good lives tend to contain. Marguerite Vasquez came to see the baby in May of 1884 and held him with the ease of a woman who had held 3 sons of her own, and told Oliver he had done something right, and told Henrietta she had done everything right, which was not entirely accurate and was entirely appreciated. Clara Hinds became the effective co-manager of Monroe's dress and fabric shop by the end of 1884, which allowed Henrietta to shape her days more according to the rhythm of the ranch and the child and her work than according to a fixed schedule. She still designed, still took the commissions that interested her most, still made the dresses that needed making, but she had built something real enough that it did not need her every hour. The shop sign still said Monroe's, because it was her name and her founding, and the name was earned, and Oliver had never suggested it should say anything else, which she had not told him was one of the things she had loved him for, but it was. Samuel took his first steps in October of 1884, going from the kitchen table to the kitchen window, where the little cactus still sat on the sill, reaching for it with the determined concentration of a child who has identified a destination. Oliver caught him just before he made contact with the spines. "Not that one," Oliver said, redirecting him toward the windowsill itself, and Samuel looked at the cactus with an expression of focused interest that his mother recognized immediately. "He has my curiosity," Henrietta said, from the table where she was working. "God help us," Oliver said, with a love in his voice that made the words into something entirely warm. In the spring of 1885, Henrietta found that she was expecting a second child. She told Oliver this time while facing him directly in the parlor in the evening, and he received the news with a smile that was immediate and true. "Another Samuel?" he asked. "Decidedly not," she said. "One Samuel is exactly the correct number of Samuels." The second child, born in November of 1885, was a girl. They named her Frances, after Oliver's grandmother, who had been, by his account, a woman of considerable force of character and good humor, and Henrietta approved of both qualities as naming criteria. Frances Oliver Bancroft arrived in the world with her father's green eyes and her mother's decisive expression, and the household was more complete for her presence. Samuel, now a year and a half old, regarded the new arrival with the initial suspicion of the previously singular, and then, within a week, with the protective attachment of the older sibling that he would carry for the rest of his life. "He has appointed himself her guardian," Oliver said, watching Samuel sit beside the cradle with the solemnity of someone on watch. "Good," Henrietta said. "He can start young." The ranch had grown by this point. The herd more than doubled, the land expanded by the purchase of an adjacent 15 acres when the neighbor decided to move his operation west. Oliver was a good rancher, not because he was the most aggressive or the most ambitious, but because he was methodical and patient and honest, and cattle and land responded to these qualities in the long run better than they responded to the alternatives. He had also, quietly and without announcing it, become something of a reader to the ranch hands, the 2 or 3 men who worked for him year-round, sitting with them in the bunkhouse on winter evenings and reading aloud from whatever novel he had going, because one of the hands could not read and the others preferred listening to reading themselves. Henrietta found out about this from the carpenter who had done work on the bunkhouse and mentioned it in passing, and when she asked Oliver about it, he shrugged in a way that meant he had not thought it needed mentioning. "You could teach him to read," she said. "Wade, you could actually teach him." Oliver looked at her. "I have thought about that," he said. "I did not know if he would want it." "Ask him," she said. He did. Wade, the hand who could not read, a man of 35 who had grown up in circumstances that had not afforded him the opportunity, accepted the offer with a combination of dignity and hunger that Oliver understood immediately and treated with the respect it deserved. By the spring of 1886, Wade could read well enough to work through a newspaper on his own, and he did so every morning with the serious pleasure of someone who has acquired a thing of great value. Oliver told Henrietta about this on a spring evening on the porch, with Samuel asleep inside and Frances in her arms, and his voice had a quiet satisfaction in it that she recognized as the sound of a person who has done something they were always meant to do. "You should have been a teacher," she said. "I think," he said, looking at the darkening prairie, "I do all right." "Yes," she said, "you do." She leaned against him on the porch swing, Frances sleeping against her shoulder, the sound of the Kansas night settling around them, the distant cattle, the insects in the grass, the creak of the swing's chain, and the stars above the ranch absolutely brilliant and innumerable in the way they are when you are far enough from a town and the sky is perfectly clear. "I am happy," she said. It was a statement she did not make lightly. She was a precise person about most things, and she was precise about this. She did not mean she was content or comfortable, or that the difficulties of life had been removed, because they had not and would not be. She meant happy in the full sense, the kind that is the sum of real love and real work and real friendship and real place. Oliver turned his head and kissed the top of her hair. "So am I," he said. The years turned over them like the seasons on the Kansas prairie, each one with its particular character. The winters hard and intimate, the three of them in the warm house with books and the lamplight and the good solid life they had built. The springs generous, the world renewing itself with the particular extravagance of a land that is large enough to mean it. The summers full and busy, the work of the ranch and the shop and the children and the community expanding to fill the long days. The falls beautiful and melancholy in the way that things that are ending their cycle are always beautiful and melancholy, and the harvest done and the herd moved and the accounts tallied, and the quiet satisfaction of another year completed. Marguerite Vasquez came to visit twice a year, at Christmas and in the summer, and she and Oliver Monroe had developed a friendship of such thorough mutual esteem that their visits had become one of the fixtures of the household calendar. The two women sat on the porch in the summer evenings and talked, and what they talked about Henrietta and Oliver did not entirely know, but the sound of it, the low voices and the occasional laughter, was one of the good sounds of those years. Marguerite's burns had healed as cleanly as the doctor had promised, and she wore the blue silk dress to her youngest son's wedding and was, by all accounts, the most elegant person in the room. She wore the burgundy wool on various mornings when she wanted to feel like herself, exactly as Henrietta had designed it for, and she did so with the unapologetic pleasure of a woman who has finally accepted that she is allowed beautiful things. Samuel grew into a boy with his mother's directness and his father's patience, which was a useful combination, and he was 6 years old when he asked his father what a cowboy was, specifically, as distinct from simply a man who worked with cattle. Oliver thought about this with the seriousness he gave Samuel's questions, all of which deserved it. "A cowboy," he said, "is someone who goes where the work is and does what needs doing and gets back on the horse when he falls off, which he will frequently. It is not a romantic life," he said, "it is a real one." "Were you a cowboy?" Samuel asked. "I was," Oliver said, "for many years, and now I am a rancher," Oliver said. "Which is better because at the end of the day I come home." Samuel considered this with the gravity of a 6-year-old considering an important matter. "Where do you come home to?" Oliver looked at the house, where through the kitchen window the lamplight was visible and Henrietta was moving inside, and on the sill the small cactus still sat in its terracotta pot, still alive, still growing slowly in the way that resilient things do. "Right here," he said. The cactus, for the record, was flowering. It had begun to do so the spring after Henrietta had moved it to the kitchen window, a small yellow flower appearing at the top of it in April, and then another in the following April, and then another, and this had continued so that every April there was a small yellow flower on the kitchen windowsill, and Oliver brought it up at the table every year, and Henrietta pretended to find this unremarkable, and everyone in the family knew she did not. In the year 1888, when Samuel was 4 and Francis was 2, and the ranch was thriving, and the dress shop was among the most successful businesses on Commerce Street, and Clara Hinds had become a full partner in the operation, Henrietta sat at the kitchen table one evening with her notebook open and a list in front of her, and Oliver sat across from her with his coffee. And they were doing the particular domestic accounting of two people who manage their life together with the same attention they bring to everything. "We are all right," she said, meaning the finances, the land, the operation. "We are more than all right," he said. She looked at him across the table. He was 36 years old now, his brown hair with the first hint of silver at the temples that had appeared in the last year, and his face more settled and weathered and, she thought, more beautiful for all of it. He had the face of a man who had lived a life that meant something and knew it. "I want to do something for Clara," Henrietta said. "The shop. I want to put her name on the sign." "Monroe and Hinds," Oliver said. "Monroe and Hinds," she said. "She has earned it." "Yes," he said, "she has." "And I want to put some money into the schoolhouse," she said. "The new schoolhouse they are building on 5th Street, I want to contribute." "Good," he said. "I will contribute too." And she said, with the particular care of approaching a thing she had been thinking about for some time, I want to write to my cousin in St. Louis and tell her that if she or her daughter ever want to come west, we have room." "We do," he said. "I know we do," she said. "I was stating it so it was clearly said." He smiled at her. "Henrietta," he said. "Yes. I would like, before we continue the planning," he said, "to say something." "What is that?" she asked. He set down his coffee and looked at her across the table in the lamplight with the same direct honesty he had looked at her with across her counter in October of 1882. A man who said what he meant and meant what he said. And he said, "6 years ago, I walked into your shop with my hat in my hands and asked you for something worthy of the bravest woman I had ever met. And you gave me what I asked for, and then you became the answer to a question I had been asking for 30 years without quite knowing it was a question." He paused. "You are the bravest person I know, Henrietta. Braver than Marguerite, and she is extraordinary. Braver than anyone I have encountered in this territory. And I am grateful every single day that I walk through that door." She looked at him for a long time. The lamplight was warm between them, and outside the kitchen window the first stars were appearing in the darkening sky over the Kansas prairie. She said, "You walked through that door for someone else." "I did," he said, "and I found you." She got up from her chair and walked around the table, and he turned in his chair, and she sat on the edge of the table beside him and took his face in both her hands the way she had in the unfinished kitchen of this same house in December of 1882, and she looked at him and said, "And I am grateful every day that you did. Every day, Oliver. That you came in with your hat in your hands and your good honest face and your commission for the bravest woman you had ever met. That you stayed. That you built this." She gestured with one hand to include the house and the land and the sleeping children and the whole constructed fact of their life together. "That you are here." He took her hands from his face and held them in his and said nothing, because there was nothing to say that the holding did not say better. The small yellow flower on the cactus on the kitchen windowsill caught the lamplight. Outside, the prairie was dark and enormous and full of stars, and in the house that Oliver had built and Henrietta had made into a home, everything was as it should be, which is the best and rarest thing that can be said about any life at any moment, and it was said about this one truly and without reservation, and it would go on being true for a very long time. Monroe and Hinds became the finest dress establishment in southern Kansas, with customers coming from as far as Wichita and Dodge City. Clara Hinds, whose name now appeared on the sign in the same painted letters as Monroe's, proved to have her own vision and voice as a designer, and the shop expanded in 1889 to include the storefront next door, doubling the workroom space and taking on 2 additional seamstresses, both of them young women from working families who learned their trade with the same focused hunger that Clara had shown and that Henrietta recognized and nurtured, because she knew what that hunger was and where it could go. Samuel Monroe Bancroft started school in the autumn of 1889 at the new schoolhouse on 5th Street, to which his parents had been among the largest contributors, and he walked to school on the first morning of term with his father's patience already evident in the way he waited at the gate while his younger sister Frances took her time pulling on her coat. Frances, at 4, could not yet attend, but she had accompanied them to the school gate on this first morning, and she stood very straight in her green wool coat and watched her brother go in with the expression of someone who intends to be there herself at the earliest possible opportunity. Oliver stood beside Henrietta at the school gate watching Samuel walk through the door and said very quietly, "The schoolteacher I was going to be." "Samuel will be something else," Henrietta said. "He is too stubborn for teaching." "He gets that from you," Oliver said. "He gets it from both of us," she said, "which means he will be formidable." Oliver laughed and she laughed, and they walked back to the wagon together in the September morning, and the town of Caldwell moved around them in its daily business, and the life they had built was solid beneath them and above them and around them, and the future was open and well lit, and the Kansas sky was enormous and blue, and everything was, as it had been, and as it would continue to be, exactly right.